thank you very much for joining at various times all over the world. Welcome to the Professional Development Workshop by the STR division, fostering publications from around the world in leading organizations, strategy journals. Before we start, I just wanted to make sure that I give you some housekeeping rules or information. First, as you can see, probably at the top left of your screen, the session will be recorded because some of it will be made available to the STR membership. There will also be a stage when we will ask you kindly to switch all your cameras on in case you haven't done so anyway, that we can take a picture at the end of all your happy faces. Please switch your microphones off if you haven't done so, just to make sure that we don't have any interference here. If you have any questions to any of the speakers today, please ask your question via the chat function. We might then call your name to ask your question, or if there are a couple of times a similar question, I will just read it out. So we're going to have a couple of people manage. We might also have some of the speakers answering directly via the chat function if it works. And at the end, as you know, some of you have submitted papers to get feedback on. So we will have at the very end then breakout rooms for the registered participants as well. So again, as I said, welcome to the Fostering Publications from Around the World, Leading Organization Strategy Journals, a workshop that the STR division has kindly supported over the last few years now, for many years now. And the idea is that we want to make sure that the international audience and international academics get involved with the Academy of Management. The membership has grown. It is not an American-based, was an American-based, but it's not an entirely American or Northern American association membership anymore. So we want to make sure that we engage and reach out to the international audience. So what we're going to do today is we have my opening. We then have an editors panel first. So where they give an insight about their journals. They also give some insights and experiences they have with publications or journal submissions from outside Northern America, possibly, and challenges and common pitfalls. We have 5 speakers here. And more than advertised, actually, so that's great. We have Samina, Karim, who's Senior Editor of Org Science and also the current Division Chair of the Strategic Management Division. We have Ilya Cuypers, Associate Editor from AMJ, Caroline Flammer, Associate Editor from SMJ. We have Jorge Walter, former Associate Editor and Editorial Board now, Journal of Management, if I'm correct. And we have Sharon Alvarez, Associate Editor from the Academy of Management Review. After that, we have a Global Scholars panel. So we give you some insights from people from various parts of the world about publishing and building an academic career outside Northern America. So we have Yuliya from Toulouse Business School, Tim from the UK with also an Australian experience. We have Roberto from Argentina. And if there's time left, we'll also talk, but I think we have now a bigger panel at the start, so you probably don't have to listen to me after my introductions and moderation. As I said, then we have the break and go into the paper development session. Just to give you a bit of an idea, the reason why we have this, the Strategic Management Division has set up a system where we have global scholars, which represent the various parts of the world. You can see the names here. This year's workshop was organized by Michael and Carlos mostly, with very great help by Elena. And you can see we have Ramsey and Obi as well as global representative. I'm outgoing, so this is my last performance session. I'm out. And we have then incoming June Manli from Korea and Wei Cheng here from Sydney University of New South Wales. So if you have any questions to any of those representatives and any concerns or any ideas on how to engage with us and the Strategic Management Division, just let us know via any of us. But other than that, I'm actually gonna straight away jump now into the next part. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. We have Samina, who's gonna talk from her perspective about the journal organization science, but she's also experienced with other journals. And also maybe she wants to welcome you as well, given that she's the current division chair for Strategic Management Division. So I'm quiet, Samina, take over.
Thank you so much.
By the way, I should just say, I'm going to interrupt any of the speakers after around 8 minutes. So I have that right today.
All right, this does not count as part of my 8 minutes. So on behalf of the division, I want to welcome everyone here. And I want to give a special thanks to Michael, Ralf, and Carlos, and Elena for putting this together. They are 4 of the most dedicated people I know. And this is something that the division is very supportive of because more than half our membership is outside of North America. So we have always really devoted our resources to having this PDW every year. All right, now my 8 minutes starts. So now I will go much faster. And let me share my screen. Let's make sure everybody can see that. You can get a thumbs up. All right, super. So I'm going to be speaking to, I'm trying to get rid of this bar that's down here. All right. So I was instructed to, oh, let's see, does it not want to go? There we go. All right. So I was instructed to represent org science, but I want to give you some background because I think we all have our biases based on different journals that we've represented. So I actually just finished being an associate editor at SMJ for the past 6 years, and I'm still handling a few papers there. So I'm very much also influenced by that journal, but I know Caroline is going to do a great job speaking much more about the details about that. So today I'm going to focus on org science, where I just started as a new deputy editor, and I'll explain what that is in a few seconds. All right, so our instructions were give an overview of the journal, address what is a good paper, share strategies to be successful with a submission, and any more insights that we can give. All right, so organization science, our editor-in-chief is Gautam Ahuja, who is at Cornell University. And we have about 30 senior editors, of which 5 serve as deputy editors. So this isn't something you see when you look at the website, but what happens is papers come in, they go to one of the 5 deputy editors, and then we suggest to the chief editor who we think the best editors, senior editors would be to handle the paper, including ourselves. And then the chief editor makes the decision looking at everyone's workload about which senior editor should handle the paper. So I decided to do a quick word cloud that shows you the senior editor's expertise. And so these are the senior editors' keywords, not submissions. But what you see very quickly are some things that jump out at you that's important to org science. So organizational, organization, corporate, strategy, theory, social, innovation. So these are words that very much represent the journal, management, responsibility, right? I could go on. So I think a glimpse of the senior editor's keywords is quite telling about what the journal represents. All right, so what kinds of papers do we publish? I took this right out of the website, and I just want to highlight some of the things. I won't read everything. If you look in yellow, it says it's about organizations, processes, structures, technologies, identities, capabilities, forms, and performance. So practically everything about an organization, but that's what's key. It has to be about an organization. The research, we look at things from different disciplines. So OB, strategic management, psychology, sociology, political science. So we get papers from all of these other disciplines beyond strategic management because they're all speaking about organizations. We welcome research at different levels of unit of analysis. So we have organizations, groups, units, individuals, networks. And then I highlighted in blue that we accept papers of very different methodologies. All right, some quick facts about org science, and these are very rough numbers. We have 6 issues per year, usually one of which is a special issue. So that means really 5 issues, roughly, that are not a special issue. About 12 papers per issue, so that's 72 papers published a year. And 6 issues per year is less than some of the other top journals that we have in our field. About 1,250 new submissions that are coming in, of which, what you'll see is in 2016, we had 800 submissions, and in 3 years, we've grown to 1,250. So org science is growing at a huge rate, 56% over 3 years and rising. And we have different types of papers. Most of our papers are what I'd say are regular research papers. Perspectives are papers that scholars are trying to highlight some important area that we should be looking at, and crossroads are debates. The number of submissions that are revisions that are coming in are about 350. So you see the journal gets about 1,600 submissions a year that we're handling. The acceptance rate, this is very rough. We'd like to just say less than 10%. This is on par with other top journals. Our turnaround time is just over 2 months at about 75 days. And one thing that's important is for Org Science, we ask that authors rank top 3 reviewers and editors that you think you would prefer for your paper who are best suited. And you may get a revise and resubmit. You may also get a reject and resubmit, which is something Org Science does give as a decision. And usually we try not to go beyond 2 revisions before a decision. Again, that's the average. There's always exceptions to the rule, but usually we don't go past 2. So what's a good paper for Org Science? Something about organizations. But the key, and this is a quote from Gautam Ahuja, our chief editor, you need to have a contribution to theory for the topic you're studying, irrespective of methods. So whereas, for example, SMJ would welcome a paper that's just an empirical study of something that's already been discovered, at Org Science, you do need to have some new contribution to theory. The key here is I'm not saying new theory. And what do I mean by that? I think it's very daunting to say you need to create new theory. So knowledge-based view, resource-based view, these are very important theories in our field. What we're saying, it has to be a contribution to that. So there's a lot of nuances and things we're learning about the theories. And so you need to contribute to our understanding of that. So likely what happens is a paper is sent to someone that's in your topic area. And if we need help on methods, an editor can always go to what we have called our research methods panel for extra advice and feedback on your paper about your methodology. And so strategies for a successful paper submission, I'm going to go very quickly through these and we can talk at the end. I like to say that a paper should address these 4 questions. So what do we know? So you identify your audience and at least cite 3 recent papers that are relevant. What don't we know? Why should we care? And what does your study help us to understand? So your motivation and contribution. You should have some clarity and precision of your hypotheses and constructs. So how is your question framed and argued and operationalized? And so what's key here, I think, is having things be consistent and match up. Why are you studying the variables you are and not other ones? So, you know, it shouldn't look like, oh, I found this data and I'm just doing something with it. We want to know that there's kind of thoughtful scholarship there. Be mindful of scope. So don't try to detract from your main contribution or do too much in your paper. And, you know, quickly there's all of these other things, alternative explanations, make sure you talk about your descriptive statistics, you know, think about limitations. I won't go through the whole list. I think it's always great to write a cover letter because as senior editors, we do read them. So tell us a quick, you know, paragraph that summarizes your paper, any necessary explanations, whether you have other papers that use this data set, or if there's certain reviewers who you think particularly are well suited. That's all important information for the senior editors to have. And I also like to say a good paper submission is one that before it was submitted, you had gotten feedback on. So either through reading circles and brown bags, force yourself to make a 20-minute presentation like you do for some of the conferences we go to, because it'll identify whether you can get to the point succinctly. And then-
Sorry, it's about, you're done, but yeah, I give you 20 more seconds.
Perfect, last slide. So as global scholars outside of the North America region, you have opportunities. One is to look at what's unique about the setting you have. And I think what's key for Org Science is to draw out why that's relevant. So you might be able to look at business groups and emerging markets that you can't look at in the United States or in Canada. And you might have certain questions that you can only ask about institutions in other countries or domains. The only issue that you want to think about, to be cautious about, is generalizability and validity of your data that might be new data that isn't as vetted. And I'll stop there.
Perfect, thank you so much. I think next year we should actually organize this about the editor should pitch why you should submit to actually their journal. Should make a bit of a different type of system next year. But thank you so much. We're gonna take questions afterwards because there were already some in the chat. Ilya.
Okay.
Can go next.
Hi everybody. You should be able to see my share screen. Is that correct? Okay. Excellent. My name is Ilya Cuypers. I'm based at Singapore Management University.
Ilya, we don't see it.
We don't see a screen. No, not yet.
No?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry. There was some kind of lag there. Okay, so my name is Ilya Cuypers. I'm based at Singapore Management University. I'm one of the assistant editors at the Academy of Management Journal. Samina has given you great advice, also some generic advice, be clear about your constructs. I'll talk a little bit more specific about AMJ. Let me start a little bit with some basic information. We would argue we're the flagship empirical journal of the Academy of Management. Later, you'll also hear about the more theoretical or the theoretical journal of the Academy of Management. It's also important to emphasize that we're a general management journal. The importance of this, I'll come back a few times, but I think that's important to kind of consider when you're submitting a manuscript. We're by no means a specialist journal. We're very broad. So basic numbers, impact factor is 7.5. We get about 1,600 submissions a year. That seems to be growing every year as well, so we'll probably end up higher this year. Our acceptance rate is about 5%, and our average turnover is 60 days. Now with the COVID situation, sometimes it's a little bit longer. That's something we really try to make as an editorial team, but also the reviewers are really committed to try to get their assessments of the manuscripts back well within those 60 days. I think what's important to kind of highlight, given that you all an international audience, we really embrace diversity in research, different types of papers, methods, but also in how the journal is run. And from the editorial team, we have 11 different nationalities. More than 50% of the editors or associate editors are located outside the US. And in the editorial review board, we see similar levels of diversity. I think that's kind of important, given that we're getting more and more manuscripts from every corner of the world as well. Okay. I want to highlight or talk a little bit about the manuscript flow at the AMJ, which might be a little bit different than at other journals. Also because it's a very broad kind of management journal. So all manuscripts that are submitted get handled by the senior managing editor, who's Mike, who basically kind of looks and has a first look at every single manuscript. Then it goes to the editor-in-chief. He makes a desk rejection decision, and otherwise, depending on whether it's a qualitative paper, a macro paper, or a micro paper, then sends it to a deputy editor. Okay, so we have a separate track for qualitative papers, because typically the developmental process of qualitative papers might be a little bit different. So I think that's important to kind of highlight, because many of you will also be doing qualitative research. Okay, then it goes to the deputy editor, an associate editor gets assigned, goes to 3 reviewers, typically 2 are from the editorial review board, then a third one is a more ad hoc reviewer. They provide an assessment and we make a decision. Okay, so that's kind of the flow of how your manuscript would go through the system. Okay, so what are some key ingredients for a paper to be published at the AMJ? And I think theoretical contribution is very important. Relevance of your paper or your manuscript is very important. And then finally, empirical rigor and transparency. So I want to talk a little bit more about these 3 ingredients in the next few minutes. So first of all, theoretical contribution is something we really put a lot of emphasis on. You need to have a clear or substantial extension or refinement of an existing theory, or develop new theory altogether. Although the latter, like Samina said, is quite challenging and daunting, but regardless, we expect some kind of extension or refinement of an existing theory. Okay. That should typically be reflected in the introduction and framing. Typically, AMJ papers have a stronger theoretical grounding than at some other journals. Authors focus more on identifying a theoretical gap rather than an empirical research gap. Okay, so simply applying existing theory or looking at a new or different context, maybe from your home country, or a new phenomenon is typically not sufficient in terms of contribution to get your paper published in AMJ. Of course, a new phenomenon, a new context can add additional value, but on its own, it might not be sufficient. Relevance, I think it's very important that you're joining an important conversation in the field of management and society. Okay, so something practitioners care about, other stakeholders in society as well. So an important question you should be asking yourself is whether your study defines a new conversation that's important, diverts an existing conversation in a more or in a new meaningful direction, and that conversation has to be broadly relevant. So it's important to kind of consider whether the conversation might be only relevant in your home country if you're from somewhere, or if that's really relevant in a broader kind of sense or across many parts of the world. Okay, so like I said before, AMJ is a generalist management journal, so the conversations that are going on might be broader or different than those you might find in specialized journals or in a specific home country. Okay, Final point here, the analysis has to fit the theory and the findings have to be credible. And I think there's two very important aspects to this. First of all, rigor. All your analysis should be conducted in line with the latest and best practices for a particular method, whether that's qualitative or quantitative. Your data should be suitable. It should be the best data available to test your theoretical ID and so on. And second, transparency is also very important, although this might mean different things depending on what kind of methodological approach you use. But as an author, you should really take all possible steps to ensure that the data collection process is transparent, the analysis is transparent as possible. Okay, and all of that kind of adds to empirical rigor and transparency. Okay, so I probably don't have too much time left. We have a great deal of resources on our website, although the website is being migrated right now. You can find a bunch of editorials where some of the past or current AEs or editors of AMJ are talking about what constitutes a theoretical contribution, some empirical issues, how to do qualitative research. All these things you can find on here. Also, if you have a question, it doesn't get addressed in the chat box, feel free to drop me an email and contact me. Okay, that should be just in time, Ralf. Okay.
Perfect, 30 seconds too fast, but you know, I take it. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna hand over to Caroline. Stop sharing your screen, please. Or I can do it for you.
She can, okay, perfect, thank you.
I can, thank you. Caroline? Your mic is off. But your screen is there.
Excellent. Okay, well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me. And let me just put this in presentation mode. So I don't seem to have received the instruction to really talk about the statistics of SMJ, or maybe I've just ignored them. I don't think they're that interesting. I mean, I don't think that's the best use or the most informative part. And most importantly, you can read that on the website. So I'm just going to skip that part. No offense to the previous speakers, please. But let me perhaps take a different approach a little bit and focus less on the paper per se, but rather think about research, correct? And as you may know, I'm Swiss, and time is fundamentally important to Swiss. But I would make an argument that it's fundamentally important to every one of us. Every one of us is somewhere on this timeline, correct? And to me, the key question really, when you think about research is, where do you eventually want to have an impact? What's your goal? What do you want to understand? And where do you want to contribute? And then, so think about this hard, and then start now to pursue that long-term impact. You might be in the PhD phase, or you might already be a junior faculty or more senior, but the earlier you start and think about where do you want to have impact, the more likely you will achieve your long-term goal. And to me, this is really fundamentally important in trying to think about what kind of research do you actually pursue. What I'd also like to say, I'm by no means really representative of the voice of SMJ. This is my point of view. I just want to clarify this. In my perspective, any good paper, any high quality research will get published in any of these journals. You will see that many of the points that I mentioned are really very similar to the one that Ilya said, that Samina said, and that the following members probably will say. So in my view, high quality research will get published. And then luckily we have several journals where you can publish it. So let me just share with you my approach, okay? And so first of all, I would encourage you to focus on a few, the most promising research ideas that help you achieve your long-term goal of where you want to have impact and build up your research identity. There are a couple of things to note. First of all, there's no such thing like a quick project. Every single project takes a long period of time. A few publications are worth much more than multiple working papers. And consider going on vacation and enjoy life instead of spending time on non-promising projects. Okay, with that in mind, now how do I identify the most promising projects, okay, that are aligned with my long-term goals? First of all, and these are kind of what I consider the 8 critical questions, and you will see that these are very much aligned with Ilya and what Samina said. Okay, so What is your research question? Then what's the research gap? Engage with and build on the extant literature. Don't just ignore it, but build on it. Then why is it important to close that gap? Why should every single person in this world care about closing this gap? What's your theoretical argument? How do you measure your theoretical constructs? What's your identification strategy? What's your empirical approach? Then how do you interpret your results? And last but not least, what's the implication for practice? Now, I very often get the question from scholars who do work on global data sets, for example, or global non-US focused research questions, and or from scholars who do sustainability, okay? And they ask me, how do you get published in the A journals? Quite frankly, if you are doing research in this area, be it kind of in global setting or sustainability this is your chance. Bring home those points. What's the research gap? There are enormous research gaps, enormous. Most of the research so far has been focused on North America and Europe. There are enormous gaps. Many of the theories might not hold in a different context. But then when you identify that gap, then explain to us, how does that difference lead to different theoretical predictions and where the existing theories don't hold, okay? If you use data from a different context, flesh out the data. This is like the diamond. If you have a rich database, it can really bring home the project and just explain what's so different, et cetera, et cetera. And then what are the implications for practice? Arguably that directly feeds back to why is it important to close that gap? So I think there were a couple of points. So I would say 2, 3, 4. Then the data, if it's a new data set, and the implications. This is really when, if you do research that is not focused on the typical context, this is where you can really, really make a contribution. Okay, now let me go back to my research approach. Okay, so now, so you think about these 8 critical questions, and then you make a selection of which project do you actually really want to pursue, where you feel, okay, that scores high on all these questions. Be your most evil devil's advocate throughout the process. I can tell you, I'm driving my co-authors probably crazy because I tried to kill my project first before I continue pursuing it. Seek feedback, as Samina also mentioned, ask for friendly reviewers, ask your colleagues within the department, faculty, doctoral students, give seminars, present at conferences, then do one thorough revision, hope for the best, and then address all major and minor concerns raised by the editor and reviewers. Last but not least, it's very important, celebrate your success. Life is too short, don't wait for the big acceptance. Revise, resubmit, celebrate. Champagne is way too good to wait for once in a lifetime. Okay, that's it for my side.
Perfect, thank you very much. You're also on the time, so time is important to you. So you gave me some back, which Samina wasted at the start. Just kidding.
I am Swiss, you know that.
Yeah, that's all good. I'm German, so you know we understand each other. So anyway, we move to the next one, who I think actually is another German, so that works perfectly. Jorge. Yes, we can see your screen. Can't hear you yet. I can unmute you if that helps.
Thank
you. Yep.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for having me. If I get this on the full screen for you guys, then we're all set. So you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so very quick, my name is Jorge Walter. I am I just finished literally 1st of July, my 3-year term at Journal of Management as an associate editor there. I've also done for many years reviews and worked as session chair and division chair at the Academy and at the SMS. So I'm kind of trying to share a few ideas on what I've learned over time, especially coming from and being trained in an environment outside North America. I've also taken, like Carolyn, I've taken a different spin on this. Don't want to share too much about Journal of Management. Two reasons for that. One is I think that a lot of the recommendations or the numbers or the submission rates and things like that are very similar among the top 10, top 20 journals. So there's a lot of the same information that I would share. Second is there's also some changes I believe that the new incoming editor now has made. You will find all that on the Journal of Management website. I encourage you to look there, or any journal you're submitting to. I think there's a wealth of information out there. So I don't want to spend too much time on these issues. What I want to do is share essentially 5 things I think I've learned over the years reviewing and in my role as an editor. The first one is coming from the outside, especially if you're not trained in the way we do publications, or the game of publishing, for lack of a better word, is that you really need to understand the rules and play by the rules. I think it's futile to come in and think you have a great idea or great data, and the reviewers will just get it when you tell them your story, right? I think it's very crucial that you frame it in a way they understand it, that you're not surprising them, that you play by the rules and traditions that they're used to. I think that's the first key insight I saw. A lot of papers come in and they don't conform to the rules, and they have a very difficult chance in these journals. The second point is, how do we figure this out? How do we understand these rules? And I'm with Jay Barney in his discussion on the resource-based view. There's no, I wish there were, but there's no rules for riches, right? So nobody can tell you what it takes to get published for sure, right? I think all my co-panelists here on the same boat, we get a lot of rejections ourselves, still do, some are frustrating. So there's clearly no way you can make this work every time. However, what struck me as it was really striking for me when I worked as an editor at JOM the last couple of years, is so many papers arrive what I call dead on arrival. They never stand a chance. And there's also strikingly very few reasons for that. There's always the same basic issues, I think, with papers that the reviewers simply conclude, oh, there's not enough contribution here, and they're gonna recommend rejection. It's very hard to salvage something like that. And you see some listed here, and I don't want to go in detail here. We've seen a lot of them already being mentioned by my fellow panelists here, right? But it shows you how generic these issues are, how often they pop up. I eventually ended up writing short snippets, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? For each of those that I just adjust them to a particular paper because they occur over and over again, and they're basic things. Now, how do you figure this out, especially if you're like me, not trained in the US system? And I think there's plenty of great resources for that. The first one is pick some articles you like, authors you really admire. Eisenhardt seems to be a favorite of every doctoral student I've ever met. Take her work if you're interested in the topics she's writing about, or look at her work if you're working in comparative case studies. It's very well done, right? She really nails these kinds of things. So learn from that. Emulate that, not copy it, but see what works, why it works, and try to emulate that style. There's also great articles out there on things like moderation mediation, which gets done wrong all the time. There's a great article in SMJ, I believe, called Thinking About You, the curvilinear U-shaped relationships. Walks you through how to write theory and test nonlinear relationships. It's a great resource for me every time, and I see it being done so many times in the wrong way, and reviewers don't react kindly to this. Right? These are basic rules about proposing and testing these kinds of relationships. Editorials are great. I think Ilya mentioned the AMJ. There's a whole like bumper to bumper series in 2011 or something like that, or 12, from setting the hook, framing, theorizing, testing. Excellent resources. We learned over time how they work, and we still look back, many of us, and when we publish our papers or try to submit our papers, and look at these recommendations. They're not rules for riches again, but they really help you stand a chance and be evaluated based on the merits of your ideas. Same for JOM. In my journal, we have excellent editorials on the review issue proposals, right? We have these twice a year review issues. Many proposals coming in I've looked at do not conform to the basic rules, to the basic ideas of what this should look like. And the reviewers don't take kindly to that. They really don't see what you're trying to do. Books. There's oldie but goldie and half. If you've seen this book, Writing for Scholarly Publication, key insight I took away from that is, if you write for a North American journal, it's like joining a conversation. You can't go to a party and then go to a group of people and they talk about something, you just suddenly interrupt them and talk about what you want to talk about, right? You listen for a while, you understand what they're talking about, And then you figure out how you can add to that conversation or even change the direction of the conversation, right? Very different spin on what it means to frame a particular paper or an idea for a North American journal. And then become a reviewer. We're always looking for those. AOM is always haunting us with review requests, right? SMS is in the same boat. Then go to journals. It's super interesting to see not just what you're doing, but also what the other reviewers, how they see a paper, and how the editors integrate that, how the authors respond. Huge learning opportunities vicariously with no penalty attached, right? By looking at other papers. The next point I had, besides understanding how the game is played and playing it, or one of the best ways to learn it is actually collaborating. So work with somebody who's done this before. My advisor didn't at that point. So he hooked me up with North American scholars that have this experience. And you learn in one-on-one, almost like apprenticeship model. Figure out how this works, right? Track changes, great way to see how top scholars are changing, revising things I've written. Learned a whole lot from that. You might ask yourself then, what do these guys, what can I provide? What makes them want to collaborate maybe with somebody that's new to the game, right? And it was mentioned by Carolyn before, I'm totally with her on that. As people from the outside, what we have to contribute is excellent, novel access to data. I've seen amazing studies being done abroad. There's a lot coming out of Asia right now with new data, interesting, especially sustainability you mentioned before. I've published a couple of years back on the AMJ with ridiculous data. It's a doctoral student that collected, that's not mine. So it was ridiculous data where he got top executives for hours doing mental mapping. Somebody else is not muted yet, sorry for that. Again, I think Samina already mentioned generalizability issue, but I think bringing data to the table makes you a very attractive collaboration partner for some senior scholars that can then help you on all the other things that I've mentioned before. And last, and this might seem like a very pedestrian issue, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen editors or reviewers react very unkindly to papers that simply don't get the basics right. And I'm talking about copy editing, language, grammar, spelling, stuff like that. And there's two reasons why this is a problem if you don't get it right. First one is, you will never be judged on the merits of your ideas if they don't understand what you're talking about. As a non-native speaker, I know that myself, I struggled with that for years. I'm still struggling sometimes. They don't get what you're saying. They're not going to try to figure it out. They're just going to reject you. They don't understand what you're trying to say. There's lots of mistakes, not going to stand a chance. Second issue, and I've showed you here I found an interesting example of this, an 80s rock band, Van Halen. They had this ridiculous rider in their contracts with the local venues, and it included this famous M&M clause with they wanted M&Ms with absolutely no brown ones. So why are they saying that? And what's the point I'm trying to make? The point is that this rider, years later, they did an interview and they clarified that means there is a signal for did the venue actually read the contract and are they following it? Can we trust them to take care of the other complex, maybe safety clauses in the contract if they can't even take care of the M&Ms? And the same I found true of so many articles. I've seen reviewers explicitly write that, how can we trust your data analysis if we can't even trust that you got the spelling and the grammar right? So if you don't get the basics right, I think you lose that kind of trust that the reviewers need to have in your ability, in your conscientiousness. So not getting that right is a basic mistake, unfortunately, a very common mistake, especially if you're a non-native speaker coming from the outside, that will get you rejected before you stand a chance to be evaluated on the merits of your ideas. So that's just a few thoughts on my end, and I'm happy to take any questions afterwards.
Perfect, thank you so much. The one thing I have to doubt is your German heritage because you went over time, but that's okay.
I'm here too long, that's why.
You've been here too long, let's go. Now imagine me living in Australia because that's terrible. Anyway, thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Sharon talking about AMR. Thank you.
So I need the screen share. There we go. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. Are you able to see my screen or no?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to actually hit on some very high level things. The group has done a fabulous job of talking about some more specifics. So let me I'm gonna maybe iterate on some of this stuff and hit on the high level things. So really quick about AMR. AMR is theory papers, right? Theory papers does not mean qualitative work, does not mean quantitative work of any kind. You'd be surprised at how many people get this wrong. AMR is about theory and theory papers. Now, I'm not going to go into many of the specifics of AMR because we're just now changing editorial groups. And when you get the new editorial group, they have preferences and tastes, and that too changes as the old group goes out and the new group comes in. So what I would absolutely encourage everybody to do is to go in and AMR, AMJ, AMD, all the Academy journals have a web page, and I'll get to that point a little bit more, but in that web page you find out what the current editorial team's preferences are. And so I highly, highly suggest that you go into that and do that. We publish 4 issues a year, and our impact factor is 8.43, which is a pretty hefty impact factor. So let's talk about what AMR is in terms of the theory that comes into AMR. It isn't, I probably should have switched these bullet points. It's not the front end of an AMJ paper. I recently desk rejected a paper by a couple of young scholars actually that in their introduction told me that they had testable hypotheses in this paper. Well, that to me is a flag. Well, if your hypotheses are testable, why didn't you gather the data and submit it to AMJ? Don't send it to me. I don't want testable hypotheses. What I want is I want you to give me something that changes how I think about the world. And I know that's a tall order, but nonetheless, that's what I want. Tell me, you know, resource-based theory. Resource-based theory gave us something that told us how we had to think about the world differently, right? So as opposed to everything being external, resource-based theory said, no, maybe decisions and resources and capabilities come from within the firm, and you need to look at those as much as you need to look at your external environment. So, you know, if you look at the areas that have made us change how we think, they take something that matters and flip it on its head in a way that we've never thought about it before. Interestingly enough, one of the papers that really did that for me that was submitted, which was on methods, said, you know, the methods that we use and the methodologies that we think about change how we theorize. And I was like, nobody has ever said that to me before. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And in fact, I did everything I could to get the paper through the process and couldn't, because the authors, and somebody said something about copy editing, the authors were so obscure in their language. The work was so poorly copy edited that even though I loved what they were saying, and I worked with them quite hard to try and get it to publication, I couldn't get it to publication. So when you get something rejected, don't think about it as just being, oh, you know, that editor or those reviewers. I mean, take responsibility for your part of what you're doing. Editors and reviewers are volunteering their time. You, the authors, are the ones who really stand to benefit from getting these papers published. So the other thing that I was going to say is, in this notion of how we change the world, are you really in a position to make the claims that you're making? Again, the two co-authors on this one paper that I rejected were both very young. They were both newly minted assistant professors. Had they had a senior scholar on that paper with them, they probably would have it published today. And I see so many junior scholars, I talk to them and they're like, oh, well, we have to either be first author or we have to be sole author, or, you know, you get all these ego statements is what I call them, because quite frankly, nobody cares, right? So it's better to have a published paper with 2 other authors than to have no published papers. So the name of the game is to get your ideas and get them out there and get them published, because eventually you'll be senior enough that you can do this on your own. But if you never get published, you're never going to get the chance. The other thing I've seen at AMR is I see theory from nowhere, you know, de novo theories. And it's like, in China, none of Western theories work in China. And so therefore we should start from scratch. What do I do with that paper, right? And who reviews that paper? So again, think about, so what doesn't work in China? Is it that transaction cost economics needs to be thought of slightly different? And then which assumption needs to be different, right? So what is it that doesn't work? And then pick your assumptions. One assumption at the most, perhaps two assumptions. But don't just kind of give me this, here's the bucket list of things that we need to change. So I talked about this a little bit already. Read the AMR instructions, go to the webpage. So our particular editorial team, we were big on what our editor-in-chief, Jay, calls the 3-paragraph introduction, right? So what's the state of the world? What's the problem with the state of the world? And what is your contribution to the state of the world going to be? And if you go on for 5 or 6 pages, you have turned me off as an editor. Now, those are editorial preferences. And so you want to probably go in and see what the new editorial group has to say as to how they want to see their papers. So that's just an example of why you should always read those AMR instructions. Get exemplars, and don't get exemplars of papers that were published 15 or 20 years ago. The field moves, research moves, what we consider state of the art moves. So go in and find 1 or 2 current papers within the last 3 years or so that deal with issues that you're interested in, and look and see, how did they structure the article? What are the main heads? What are the B headers in a paper? Look and see what they do. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Get a copy editor to help you before submission. Because I see this at AMR, I'm sure that people see this at AMJ. I'm sure, you know, the top journals see this, but particularly, I cannot begin to tell you how many times I see a reviewer say, for a paper submitted to AMR, people know this is one of the top journals in our field. They know that the standards should be high. And if you have any copy editing problems, they'll be like, no, don't pass go, don't, you know, go to jail immediately, rejection, right? And so your ideas never get pushed. Now, I'm going to leave you with one final thought, and this is sort of a big thought. What I have noticed, I've now been an editor for about 15 years for either one journal or another. I think it is very difficult for reviewers to see the big picture sometimes in papers. And I am going to do a call out to editors. I think we are in an era where the editors are becoming really important, and editorial judgment is probably more important than ever. And so as I kind of put this call out to the editors that are on this panel, and as I put this call out to the people that are listening to the panel, demand good editors. Because I think that's where the name of the game really is right now. I think the reviewers have a very difficult time seeing the big picture of the papers. All right, with that, I will call it a day, and I want to thank my fellow panelists and thank the organizers for putting this together.
Thank you so much, Sharon. So we have a couple of questions that came through. One question very early on was, we have about 10 to 15 minutes, so try to keep your answers short if possible. There's a question around how reject and resubmits are handled. So Samina mentioned, for example, that this is a category that Org Science has, and some other journals have that. So will the resubmission be handled by the same associate editor? And how is that process handled of a reject resubmit? if
Sure.
anyone wants to answer.
I think I can speak for, this is what SMJ and Org Science both did. Usually a reject and resubmit will go back to the editor who handled it if their load is reasonable and they can. But they have the judgment of whether to send it to the same reviewers or different reviewers. So you shouldn't assume it's going to go to the same editor, though it likely will. And you definitely shouldn't assume that it's going to go to the same reviewers, because that's the judgment of the editor. I'm trying to keep answers short.
Perfect.
So I'm going to actually put my hat on kind of as a scholar as opposed to an editor now. As a scholar, if I get a reject and resubmit, I look very closely at the comments that I got, why it was a reject and resubmit, and I revise the paper. I never send it back to the journal that rejected and resubmitted. And this is just me as a scholar. This is my advice to every junior person that's listening to me. If the journal rejected it in the first place, I've seen very few rejects and resubmits ever make it successfully through the process. And for one reason or another, either it goes back to a different editor or it goes back to different reviewers. And so I think it is a really long road if you've gotten a reject and resubmit from a journal to actually get your paper published in that journal. So my thing is, look at it, think about it, and think very hard if you really want to go back to that journal or not.
Thank you so much.
May I chime in for a very brief second to just give it, I think it's important to understand what's the policy of the journals in terms of reject resubmits, correct? So at SMJ, we are advised, so I try to stay away from giving reject resubmits. This is my own policy. I try to give clear guidance. Is it gonna be a revised resubmit or not? In line with basically what Sharon said. Now, the journal's policy guidance to editors is essentially, they advise to give or you can consider giving a reject resubmit if you yourself as an editor feel there is great promise in the study, but you will not be able to do it with the reviewers you currently have. So this gives you a chance of actually change the reviewers, correct? Or the other one is you see great promise, but there's no way you get it done within 2 or 3 or 4 rounds. So yes, so I think reject resubmits are very tricky, and a lot of time it's just a waste of time. And I agree with Sharon's approach.
Thank you. Then there's another question. So I'm trying to ask that now from an editor perspective rather than from a author perspective. There are some concerns about if you're a junior scholar or an international scholar, would you recommend posting papers that are not published yet on platforms such as SSRN? The concern mainly is is it considered to be already published, or more importantly, if people then see that you are from abroad, for example, will that actually work against you? Have any of the editors had an experience that that has worked maybe against someone because you could identify who the reviewer was? Ilya, I think, raised his hand.
Okay, so first of all, I think a lot of journals, their code of ethics kind of states very clearly that you should take your papers offline before you submit them. So I think that's important to consider. Second of all, I don't think like where you're from, right? For as an editor, it doesn't matter at all. Like whether you're from Uganda or whether you're from Brazil, the US, I don't think that ever goes into the decision. If the reviewers know you, if they're behaving ethically, they should decline the manuscript. We simply look for another editor. At the same time, if you can post it right before submitting, otherwise there's also no point of presenting at conferences where people also see your work. So in that kind of sense, it doesn't hurt to put your paper out there, but follow the codes of ethics of the journals. And I don't think who you are it shouldn't and is in most cases not going to work against you or for you. So I don't think that's something to be worried about.
Okay. Another question that was asked is pretty much every one of you has stressed the importance of maybe becoming a reviewer themselves. how do you become a reviewer for a top journal, for a leading journal? For conferences, that's obvious, but how do you become a reviewer, especially as a junior scholar who has maybe not published in those journals, or is publishing the only route? Anyone?
Sure. So I can chime in. So, you know, first of all, I think if you've published in that journal, then certainly it's a signal the journal values your work. And what you could do is first reach out to the editor who handled your paper to say, you know, thank you, et cetera, but that I'm interested in reviewing. And the first thing they'll probably ask you to do is create a identity on Manuscript Central. So reach out to the editors, and there's probably more than one at each journal, or the ones who you think would know your work and are interested in your work, and let them know that you're interested in reviewing, and send them, if it's not the editor who handled your paper, send them maybe 1 or 2 papers just attached so they get a quick sense of who you are and what you do. So I get that a lot. I get people who let me know as junior scholars that I've recently published and I'd like to review. And it just is adding to my network of people I think about that might be specifically knowledgeable about a certain methodology or a certain theoretical lens that I will call on.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to, oh, sorry, Ilya. I want to just chime in very quick too. I think it's good to review. There was a question also floating around how much that trades off with your own research and things like that. It's a great learning opportunity, but it does take, if you do it right, a lot of time. So you want to limit your commitments here and get it right. I always am a big fan of, you keep in mind that people's careers are on the line, right? You won't do a half job reviewing. There's plenty of materials on how to review. I think some of it floated around in the chat. There's others. So focus on certain journals you want to actually publish in, offer your services, right? Or they ask you, but keep your commitments to the ones you can really handle and do them right. Again, this is an important giving back to the community that gives you also a chance to learn, but you don't want to overcommit and then be late and do bad jobs. This is too important, I think, for people's careers to just do a bad job.
Okay, if we can add to that point, I think it's critical, right? Like, we're playing with people's careers, and if you're doing bad reviews, you're doing a disservice. So in the chat, I put some resources. So I strongly encourage you, if you're gonna review for any journal or any conference, train yourself as well. There's plenty of AOM resources, there's other journals. Pretty much every journal has a guideline how to write a constructive review that really helps authors, because that's also the kind of review you want to get as an author. So train yourself. I know a lot of PhD programs don't spend much time at training people to be good reviewers, but do take some time here.
Perfect. Okay, then there was a question around the contribution. You talked about contribution being important, and yes, it might differ by journals what kind of contributions are needed, but in general, do you have a recommendation that when you position your paper in the introduction, for example, and you then say, okay, I have 2 or 3 contributions, should the first one be always a theoretical contribution, or is it okay to also start maybe more with a method contribution? So that's about framing the paper and the kind of giving priority to the contribution.
Take that really quickly as from AMR. And again, this changes by editorial preferences. Somebody, someplace, I think it was in AMJ actually, wrote that they wanted a list of contributions in the introduction. That seems to have gotten lots of play. I personally despise that list. And the reason I do that is because if your contributions are so weak that you have to sit there and list them out for me in the introduction, I instantly think you have no contribution to make. So in a place like AMR, when I say, what is your 3rd paragraph, the paper of this paper, that should be your contribution. And if you cannot clearly spell to me what the purpose of your paper is, then I don't think you have a contribution. And I don't care what laundry list you give me, it doesn't impress me. And so again, I don't know, it's personal taste, it's personal preference. Somehow, someplace, this notion of a laundry list of contributions has come out, and people do it all the time, and I think that's just really weak scholarship, my opinion. That's just my personal preference. So where you should indicate the contribution of your paper is when you say the purpose of this paper is, and that should be the first sentence of your third paragraph. And if you cannot articulate that, I think you've got problems with the paper in general.
Okay, does anyone want to add, or?
May I add? I agree with Sharon. We seem to be very much aligned, Sharon. To me, again, those 8 questions that I call my research protocol, you know, what is the research gap is very important, correct? And this is where you need to have a research gap and then make a compelling point. Why do we want to close that gap? Maybe there's a very good reason why there's a gap, because nobody cares. This is unlike, I mean, this is really where, especially if you do scholarship in a global context, this is where you will have no problem at all to make a compelling point, but you need to bring the point. And then it really depends, correct? Is it theoretical, more on the theoretical side or on the empirical side? It depends where the gap is. But yes, so I agree with Sharon, kind of the laundry list. You want to speak to it and you want to have a discussion, but whether it's an introduction or a conclusion, that's a different topic.
Just to answer your question also, I do think for many, if not all, mainstream top-tier journals, there has to be a theoretical contribution, right? They all have it in their mission statement. So a purely empirical, like finding a new measurement or something like that for something, may not be enough. I think that's very common across the broad journals that we have represented here. So without that, it's not going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Because we're getting to the end, I asked one question that was actually not posted today in the chat, but we can't deal with all of them. But I asked that question because having run this now for 4 years, it has come up every other year. And I think it was kind of hinted by the editors. And it's often a concern from international scholars in how do you position or sell international data. So Jorge said that having international data can actually be the selling point, but also some people are then nervous that if you sell the data too much, it actually makes the context stand out. So how do you deal with the fact that the data is not maybe from a mainstream country? Would you stress that in the introduction already? Is it just something you try to bury in the method section and so on? So that is a question that has often been asked. If anyone wants to jump in there. Ilya?
So to me, like any data should be sold for being the best or at least very suitable data to test an ID, whether that's data for one country or another country. The specific country to me is secondary, right? But I think every study kind of has to justify, okay, this is great data to test this ID. Same transparency, whether it's data from the US or data from Belgium, it's important to kind of make sure that the reviewer, the reader really understands what this data actually consists of, how your variables are calculated, the quality of the data. So these are necessary steps for any type of data, regardless of where your data comes from. So to me, it doesn't matter too much where your data comes from. I think you need to take the same kind of steps anywhere. And in many cases, I start seeing that people in the US, they have a paper about college hockey, and they assume everybody knows college sports in all parts of the world. If you don't explain this properly, and given that reviewers are also very diverse, you're also going to run into the same kind of trouble you might if you're from China, you don't explain your data properly. So I think, to me, same kind of rules, regardless of where your data kind of comes from.
Yeah, to chime in, I'm a big fan of not surprising reviewers and readers, right? So I don't think I would bury anything. It's good to be upfront. I do understand your issue of not making the data front and center, right? In most journals, as I mentioned, the theory contribution is key. So the data is a means to an end, not the end itself. With international data, I find that in line with what Ilya was saying, reviewers accept that more and more, but they want to know about it. So let's take IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, right? So we have very stringent rules in the US of how you can collect, especially primary data. We know in other countries that may or may not be the case. So how much do I trust the data? I've seen papers from countries abroad where there's a 90% response rates to surveys. Unless you have a gun to your head, right? How do you get a 90% response rate? I've never managed to get more than 50 or 60 with that kind of population, right? So you got to clarify how even more, the hurdle is even higher, how to sell your data in terms of How did you collect it? What were the procedures you followed? Can you replicate it, right? Those are, I think, the real key issues here. Then I don't think there's any issue with foreign data versus a US data or other data. Again, it's a means to an end. I agree with Ilya on that.
Okay.
I would say there's one difference though. So if you do believe that, let's say, well-established theories do not apply in different cultural contexts, then the data becomes much more important, because you need to explain how is this context so different from, let's say, a US context. Okay, there's no doubt the world works differently in different parts of the world, yet, but we need to explain it, we need to teach our audience. And so there I would say the data becomes more important, because you need to explain what's the context, but then obviously this will have an influence on your theoretical arguments. Then you need to explain, so why is this difference in the institutional context driving, leading to different theoretical predictions, okay? But I think in this case, you probably would highlight the data or the context, the institutional context, much more upfront.
Thank you so much. So we have basically run out of time. There are some questions that were posted that I couldn't ask now in the public forum, but some of the panelists have already answered in the discussion forum, and we hope maybe some can continue answering if questions come in. So I can only say those ones who have the camera switched on or want to, let's give a hand to all of our speakers for the first round. So thank you very much. And we're gonna go to the second panel then. And this is now a perspective from scholars from all over the world about their experience publishing and leading journals, if they had some problems given the data or any other things. So we have 3, possibly 4 speakers given the time. So we start with Yuliya. If I can't see her, but she was there before. You are there, aren't you?
Yes, Julie is there.
She's there. There you go.
Oh, but
Ralf,
yeah.
do you want to take a picture before we move on?
I think Mike has already done so.
Yeah,
Yes,
I already
we
have
have
it.
taken
Awesome.
pictures. Yes. Yuliya?
Okay, so can I share my slides?
Yes.
I will. Oh, I actually can't. I think it says host disabled. Screen sharing for me.
Let us check 1 second.
Can you try now, Yuliya?
Oh yeah, now it works. Great.
Great.
Sure.
I think that are sound issues, at least on my end. I don't know if it's the same for others. You might want to switch off the camera if that continues, just in case. Am I the only one with a sound issue? You can't hear her?
I'm having the sound issue too.
Yeah, I can see your slides, but your voice is delayed. So maybe you switch off your camera.
Okay. Do you see my slides now?
We see your slides, yes. We can hear you now.
Can you see my slides? Hello.
We can see the slides, but your voice is broken.
Do that. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So I will start and make signs if you cannot hear me. Okay, I should. Okay, so thank you again for having me. I hope the connection works. So I'm Yuliya Snihur. I will provide.
Okay, is she gone? I think she's gone completely, unfortunately.
Ralf, how about if we start with the next person?
Yes, we do.
I'll help Yuliya.
Perfect. Okay, I think the next on the line was then Tim. So let's see how flexible Tim is to start and jump in there, please.
Yeah, I can easily cover this. I am not going to have any slides, so I don't have to ask you whether you can see my screen. So that one obligatory Zoom aspect of things is gone. The one thing that I guess should kind of highlight is that I've worked all over the world. You know, I've held faculty positions and still hold faculty positions in a number of different countries. And also I've been an editor of several journals, including Academy Management Perspectives, and an associate editor of several journals, including Management Science. And also for probably about 15 years now, I've been a director of SSRN, and then I now sit on the Committee on Publication Ethics. So my realm of knowledge and background is probably pretty wide. So I also kind of have a bit of a philosophy on sort of kind of publishing and things of that nature. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give it to you directly, but I'm posting in the chat a link where you can go and see some slides that I've used for many years, both as an editor and, you know, in terms of events like this to help people deal with aspects of publishing. But I think when you look at it from the standpoint of international positioning of scholars, one of the things I think that everybody has kind of highlighted is today is very different than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. The field has internationalized to the point where most associations are probably more than 50% or very close to 50% outside North America. Either in terms of where their membership resides, or where the country of origin is, even if they reside within North America. You know, so you have kind of this citizen of the world kind of logic associated with a lot of what it is that we do, and I think that that's made things a lot more open and a lot easier for scholars. But there are a couple things that I think that do matter. The one thing I would make as a recommendation in terms of the nature of people, in terms of their careers, is that you simply do not try to locally optimize. If you're going to be a global scholar, then you really have to kind of meet global scholarship norms. And what that means is getting yourself involved in associations like the Academy of Management. You know, so you have many different individuals doing work within the Academy. I was you know, in addition to being the editor of Academy Management Perspectives, I was on the executive of the International Management Division. So I ran, you know, did all of that work. So I think that it becomes important for you to kind of become engaged in the scholarship at a global level. However, you begin to do that with kind of small steps and then build it up in terms of sort of kind of people just knowing your face, recognizing who you are as an individual. The second aspect of this is that there's no substitute for quality. And it doesn't go down to the nature of whether you publish in AMJ or you publish in AMR or you publish in other fields. I've never published in an AMJ, and I actually have no intention of ever publishing in AMJ because my background is actually in economics from the University of Chicago. I didn't move into management until probably 10 years after I started my academic career. I don't actually know how to write an AMJ article. So in some sense, the question is, well, how do you play kind of the game at a higher level? And the answer is that you compete around ideas. You know, you ultimately get recognized not by the length of your resume, but by the power of your ideas and how many other people buy into the ideas that you generate, and how many other people buy into you as the sort of person with whom they want to interact. I jokingly sometimes ask people, you know, when they talk about, oh, I've got a publication in X, I sort of say, okay, well, that's really fine. I'm sure your mother's very happy. But was the whole point of the publication simply to get a line on your resume or to have material impact on the field? So I think that you have to kind of think at a higher level about, well, what is it I really want to do? Do I want to be the sort of person who, on your gravestone it says, he published and he published, but he perished nonetheless. You're not going to carry your resume with you to your deathbed, but you'll be recognized for your ideas. Nobody will remember your publications; they'll remember your ideas. So I think that's kind of the first aspect of it. And those ideas can be generated in any way, shape, or form you wish. The second aspect of it is that when you're thinking about your career, you never really want to kind of work to your current job. What you want to do is you want to work to your ideal job, to your next job. And this causes problems, for example, for many people in places like Australia. The Australia, for example, has an Australia Business Council Dean's List. And so they actually inflate many publications. So publications which we might not think of as tier 1 publications, they tend to think of as higher quality publications. And what that means is that if what you do is you shoot for the list and you shoot to simply become a professor within that system, then you may not actually put yourself in a position to get a job someplace else. And so my argument has always been in those sets of circumstances is don't play to local norms. Don't play to your own institutional norms, but to play to the global norms that most of us recognize as kind of being material. The other aspect of this is whether you choose to take what I would say is the kind of safe route in terms of the nature of the way in which you publish. I remember Jim Walsh at one point in time talking about somebody who every year they seem to have a paper in ASQ, and Jim Walsh said, well, that he cracked the code. He figured out what the code was, which the reviewers and the editors of that journal were very very cognizant of. There was kind of a style of publication that the reviewers liked and the journal liked, and you become a bit of a one journal wonder. You become very good at kind of adapting to that very specific journal. But that tends to be a very conservative type of viewpoint of things. Despite everything that journals say, and I've been a journal editor, journals tend not to like very radical papers. And part of the reason is that very radical papers will normally cause some reviewers to go offside. And therefore, reviewers will want basically things which are comfortable for them to review, but also potentially not really all that radical. So as an editor, a lot of times you end up pushing papers beyond the reviewers because you want something which is a bit edgier. You want something which is a bit harder on the literature. You want something which is written in a slightly different way to add spice to the journal. If you pick up the journal and pretty much every paper reads exactly the same, as I think is in some cases is a real problem for many major journals, then it becomes a real problem in terms of the nature of breaking ideas. And therefore, in terms of the nature of a portfolio, you have to ask the question, how much risk am I willing to accept? Am I going to kind of do 60% of my papers where I'm a bit more conservative about things? I'm using the same methods as other people. I'm using the same theories as other people. I'm justifying my theories based upon the same citations that everybody else is using. And then what part of it do I want to kind of break the mold? Where I do something which is really stretching the nature of the ideas, calling things into question. So when you look
to wrap up, Tim, please. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. When you look at this, one of the questions is you stand as kind of a scholar on the outside. You're basically running into competing norms. You're running into kind of what are the local norms associated with what it is I do, and what are the global norms which we as a larger global society kind of hold as kind of the norms of excellence. And you have to trade those off to some degree, and you have to take some risks associated with it. And your willingness to kind of trade off those risks are going to be related to whether, in fact, you can gain some real returns. So with that, I'll stop, as Ralf told me to do, and then hand over to the next speaker.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm a Eurovision host for half of the people who know what Eurovision is. I'm going to go back to France now and see if Yuliya, if the connection works now.
Yes, I will try again. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
way
great.
better.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I will share my slides. Second try.
Yes,
Great.
works. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for giving me the second chance to present. So I'm Yuliya. I will try to provide an European perspective here, a bit different from Tim that has talked more from a senior perspective. I'm more on the junior side of this, but I'm originally from Ukraine, which used to be Soviet Union when I started. I did my PhD in ESA in Spain, and I worked on business model innovation there for 5 years. I became assistant and now associate professor at Toulouse Business School from 2013 onwards. And I think the important part of this slide is that while I have this European training, I have also tried to get the US perspective. And this is something that Jorge mentioned, that you need to know the rules of the game. And even if you have a training from Europe, Asia, Australia, I think you can also get a US perspective from colleagues, co-authors, conferences. For me, for instance, I spent some time visiting at Stanford in 2016 for 4 months. And that was very useful to understand the US perspective on publishing and the requirements to get the tacit knowledge, which is not so obvious to get. So how to publish? Well, based on my experience in some journals, I think this came up several times in what the editors say, and they don't just say it, it's because this question of contribution is very important. So the first big question for any paper should be, what is your contribution? Is it novel? Is it interesting? Is it timely? And I show this slide to my strategy students. Often you have to be different from others. And how is your paper different from others? I think this is the big question that authors have to answer honestly to themselves, but also to editors and reviewers, trying to explain why others should read your paper. And today we live in this world of big data, of very short goldfish attention span. There are so many papers out there. So why should you add one more paper to this big mass of papers? And if you can honestly answer these questions with a strong answer, you can go to a top journal and argue about why they should publish your paper. But if you can't, then, well, maybe you should not go to the top journals. And I think this is the differentiating point. Second, journal choice is important. And again, Ilya mentioned, I believe, that there are specialists, there are generalist journals. So AMJ, Org Science will be generalist journals, and the competition there will be very strong because everyone wants to publish there. There are also specialist journals. So for entrepreneurship, there are JPV, ETP, for example, where competition will be only among entrepreneurship scholars, which is easier. It's easier to compete with scholars within your discipline versus answering this contribution question to a journal such as AMJ, where everyone competes. So OB scholars compete, or OMT, strategy, entrepreneurship scholars compete to get into this very small space. So the question of conversation came up a lot, and I think this is a US way to frame this, but very important question of what conversation you're joining. And you have to be able to answer this question, and different journals will have different conversations. So for instance, I publish work on business models, and long-range planning is one of the journals where this conversation is happening. So if I want to contribute to this literature, publishing in this journal, maybe not the top journal, will still contribute to the literature on business models. So you have to know your journals and choose them carefully, because this can minimize the time it takes to publication. Finally, the question of feedback, and I think this is also has been very useful for me to think about feedback as an important part of the research process. And Samina mentioned this, Caroline mentioned this, that feedback is important. So your editors, your reviewers should not be the first people reading your paper. So feedback before the submission is important, but also feedback after submission. And I love this picture that I stole from someone's Facebook. Your colleagues usually will give you positive feedback, but the editors and the reviewers will usually give you negative feedback. And you have to be able to react to this positively. sometimes others' ideas can be good ideas. It's not only your own ideas that are the best ideas. And this is the insight from open innovation research that, well, sometimes you have to accept others' ideas and combine them with your own. Sometimes editors, reviewers will have very strong points that maybe you don't think they are right, but incorporating them can improve your papers. And I think for me, this has been a learning point over time, that incorporating other people's ideas can make your own paper stronger. And it's difficult as the author to do this, but I think it's important. Finally, so a couple of more general points that I think are important in this game. We need to execute in the short term, but I think the career in academia is about long term. So research is a process. It's an arduous, difficult process. So it matters where you start. There is an imprinting. So if you start in France or you start in Australia, you are imprinted by your advisor, you're imprinted by the institution where you do your PhD, but it's not fully determined where you will end up. And in my experience, well, hard work pays off. It pays off, but it pays off over time. So for instance, for me, my AMJ, so far the first, but maybe not the last one, publication, it has taken 10 years from starting to having the idea about the project, collecting data and publishing. It's a very long time, and I'm not saying I'm a good example of this, but keep in mind that research can take a long time if you want to make a point. And you need to maintain creativity and motivation for this long haul. So really, you need some passion, you need some intrinsic motivation to go through this very hard, arduous process. How to do it? Well, I have a foot in entrepreneurship research. I think entrepreneurial mindset helps. Entrepreneurial mindset in terms of keeping a fair dose of optimism. After many, many, many rejections, you still want to submit it again to a different journal. And you might want to experiment with different options. So there are different journals. There are a lot of options out there. So if you get that rejection from AMJ, you can still do something else. There are still many options to go forward. So my advice to junior scholars is, well, do not give up. And sometimes you really feel like giving up, but well, don't. And finally, so I think this career, the big benefit of this career, it provides for lifelong learning. That's what I've been happy about for the last 10 years. I still keep learning. I still read cool papers today that I found, wow, this is such a good paper. And I'm as happy reading new papers today as I was 10 years ago. So this opportunity to keep learning is something that keeps you motivated in this profession. So this reflexive learning is important. And I think the part that motivates me, especially to keep trying, is to having role models and to have mentoring. So that's another advice. I mean, this came up also in other people's presentations. Having a role model, having a mentor helps to understand better how the field works, helps to learn over time. And the learning curve can be very long. As I started, I thought, well, I'll learn 4 years of a PhD or 5 years of a PhD. How long can it take you to learn? Now I'm 10 years into the process, and I still find that I still learn a lot about the rules of the game, about how to play it, etc. So I still keep learning, and hopefully will continue to do that. So I think that to keep in mind that when you start off, even if you have finished your PhD with cum laude, you can still learn, still have to learn a lot about the academia. Okay, I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Roberto.
Thank you, Ralf. Just please give me a minute. I'm going to present this. Good morning, or whatever it is in the world, everybody. I am Roberto Vassolo. I am a professor at the IE Business School in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and I'm also a visiting professor at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile in the School of Engineering and Systems. And I'm also an associate editor in long-range planning. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts wearing two hats. One hat is the one as a person that built, even though I was training my doctoral program in the United States, I built my entire career in Latin America, being located here. And the other, I'm going to share you some thought being the associate editor in long-range planning that handled most of the manuscript that came from outside Europe and US. So I think that these are the two areas in which I can help the most to you. And I'm going to start from my experience from long-range planning, very practical tips, thinking on the most common motive of rejection. Every time you receive a rejection, at least you lose a lot of time. And one issue that has nothing to do with this PDW, but will help you, is that long-range planning is mainly or mostly that it will strategy, but change the emphasis. For many years, this was a journal that has a very managerial flavor. During the last 10 years, it has shifted more to very research-oriented manuscripts. So we receive still a lot of manuscripts that are like had in mind the original managerial, more like not Harvard Business Review, but not that type of orientation, and this is a common mistake. The second mistake or the second problem of rejection, and this is very tricky, is that although long-range planning does not request a theoretical contribution, it does request a strong story, so you have to say something new. And this is particularly useful, I would say, to research in emerging economy. We have the trend that is okay to replicate research, but even under the replication umbrella, still we should answer why what we are doing is important, why what we are doing is interesting. These are a couple of comments from my hat of long-range planning that I highly encourage you to revise before submitting. From my experience in Latin America, mainly as a researcher, it's clear that when you are in a region, you try to leverage on what is unique on that region, what phenomena are unique in order to contribute to the global discussion. And I think that one of the best positions to take is that of extending current theory. You might be in conditions to develop a new theory on competition. It's more unlikely, and it's more likely that you will be in good conditions to analyze important contingencies that happen to that theory in competition. For example, you may be in condition to leverage on the higher level of macroeconomic volatility that's happening in that region to understand what that would imply to traditional theories on competition. So in that sense, the region gives a nice setting, since you are close to the phenomenon, to be the first in analyzing that data. Most of my research has a quantitative structure. However, I would say that if you are going to be in Latin America, you really have an advantage if you take qualitative studies. And I think that this has to do with the idiosyncrasy of Latin American managers. They are really very open, very willing to open their companies and talk. In Latin America, I grew up in this region. We are very social interactions oriented people. So it's to some extent easier than maybe in North America to get access to very good primary sources. And another aspect that you might consider when you are building a career in Latin America, the tenure track does not work with the same intensity that is working in Europe and US. So you have some possibilities of taking more risk in the research you start. So you have some sort of flexibility. From the side of the minus, in which you may need to work harder, the first is still the research environment is weaker than the one you will find in North America or maybe in Australia. So that means that when you have research, you have lower or less opportunities to test your research, to dialogue and to check. So this is something you will need to overcome. Still there is, although this is decreasing, still there is some sort of outlet bias. Journals still have suspect if the information or the data came from Latin America. Another aspect, if you are a quant guy, an econometric guy, secondary sources are not as strong. So this is a problem we deal here, and it's a problem if your personality goes more to econometrics. And also, you will find the region a relatively poor governmental support to research. Having said that, during the last 10 years, the research environment in Latin America has changed tremendously. So research opportunities in the region are really, really high. And I will say, and I will conclude with this, if we take the industry life cycle approach, the research industry is is already finished the emerging state that is now entering into the developmental stage or development stage. So there are amazing opportunities here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm just going to add now very quickly something at the end, which the other speakers haven't covered. And I just wanted to make sure because it could be of some interest to some people from my perspective. Because one thing that I think maybe wasn't mentioned as much, Tim positioned it. No one cares about where I work. But one thing that I stole from Ilya's presentation last year is that when especially as international scholars, we make a decision on what type of university to join or where we want to position ourselves is that I recognize when I talk to people at the Academy of Management and you talk to people who are trained and have positions in Northern America, mostly, or the leading European schools, is that in a lot of other countries, the models are different, right? So there are some schools within countries that will be very internationally focused. And there will be some schools that are more locally focused. The reason why I think that's important, also when Ilya talked about this last year in the similar session, is that that will kind of determine maybe what is more important at a certain stage of your career. So Tim has stressed very early on that you should always be globally focused and globally oriented, what the international game is like. While I agree with that, there are also trade-offs depending on where you want to go to and what you need to achieve. So to just give you an idea about, for example, what Australia is like, New Zealand is pretty much the same. And I would assume from what I've heard, the UK is a bit similar as well, is that in most places we have a system where we have a distribution between research, teaching and service. Now the question becomes, when does what become more important? And for example, while most people that I've courted with and worked with in the United States in the first few years up until tenure, getting, for example, grants, doing a lot of service or even supervising PhD students might not be something that is of primary concern on your CV. In Australia, that's really important. You have to apply grants very early on. There are certain grants which you can only get in your first 5 years, which are very prestigious, which I have a colleague at Monash Business School who got one of those grants for $370,000. And he actually said when he talks to international people, they don't care about this, whereas in Australia, people care about this. We, for example, as Tim mentioned, in Australia have a ranking, which is an Australian-based ranking. It is probably way more friendly than in a lot of other countries. Now, the problem is you do compete now on the one hand internationally. So I personally don't try to go to what in Australia is always considered to be an A or A star, because there's certain A star journals in Australia in our ranking, which in Europe or America are not even listed, or they're listed as a C. Now, on the other hand, if I go for internal promotion, I will be assessed with compared to my colleagues who might have had a lot of those publications. So again, here it's just important that you understand the system that you're in, but at the same time, I think it's important to also understand is if you want to leave that system at some stage, you don't only play by one system. So I always play at least by, I understand my Australian system, but I also look for, you know, if I want to go to another country, what do I need to do to actually be able to be marketable in these countries? So I just wanted to stress that while a lot of the discussion was very much focused on you know, only go to the top journals, in Australia, for example, and I think it's in other countries similar, there will be a pressure of quantity versus quality. And I think for me here, it is something which you need to play and just be aware of. So I just thought I would add that. But we're a bit over time, but I just want to make sure if there are any questions that we can answer at this stage.
Maybe to add to this, what Ralf is saying, I didn't go into this, but it's very much so in France, for example, where in my institution, but many French institutions as well, we're actually financially paid for publishing. So your salary is augmented with financial bonuses, which go up in terms of the type of publication based on the French ranking. So there is very strong financial incentives for quantity rather than quality, which obviously influences what people do.
Yeah. So for example, for me, my university now, our entire research budget is dependent on what you've published the previous year, right? And therefore there is an incentive to go for quantity to actually be able then to do better research the following years. So again, I just wanted to stress there are some trade-offs which I've come across talking to other people. So again, understand the context of the countries that you want to go into as well. There was a question on which Jorge has answered, but I just want to reiterate, there was a question for how do you actually identify what conversation you can join in what journals. And I think he gave a very good answer by saying, look at, if you're in the first 2 or 3 pages, you hardly have references from that particular journal, which have been published in the last 3 years, you're probably not joining a conversation in that journal. So I don't know if anyone else of the speakers want to add to that comment.
Yeah, I can make one point on that, Ralf. Again, this is kind of the nature of the American system, but I think it's a good one. And that is, as somebody who came up through that system, one of the first things that you learn is that in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, you have to have a tenure review. And that tenure review implies that a large number of people have to write letters for you. And the advice that I was given was very early on was, who are the 20 people that we can ask who can write letters about you, right? Who are those 20 people? Who are the people you want to say great things about you when you go up for promotion? And that takes it a little bit away from the publications, but it implies something. And that is that, who is it that I really want to notice me? And I would encourage people, and I think that this is a cultural thing. Academics are very open. A very large percent of what it is we do, we don't get paid to do. You don't get paid to be an editor. You don't get paid to be a reviewer. You don't get paid to do these PDWs. You don't get paid to do this stuff. So academics are generally very open with their time, which means that I would encourage people always to try and reach out to the people they want to talk to. Have something to say, but don't feel that it's an imposition. You have to really kind of, it becomes part of your responsibility. Nobody's going to sit there waiting for you to publish something and them to read it. You really have to you have to have what I call an influence strategy. You have to have a strategy for the people you want to influence early in your career.
Thank you. Is there any last question before we then move on to the breakout rooms for those authors that have submitted? No, okay, perfect. Then at this stage again, if everyone, if depending if it's not too late, can switch off on their cameras again and give a hand of applause to our speakers in the second part, and to everyone. Thank you so much. Mike has hopefully made some pictures, because that's what we are measured on the amount of pictures we take apparently by the STR EC. So thank you so much for everyone, for the speakers, but also, of course, for all of these people all over the world that have joined in the various time zones. It's great. We normally run this every year in person, but it's also good to see that actually having it online has led to more registrations and more participants. So that's maybe a good learning for us as well. But yeah, so if there's a lot of information in the Zoom group chat about references and so on, so you might want to copy some of the things out before you sign off. And the other thing, of course, is we have this video is recorded and will be posted online if there's something that you want to listen to again, because, you know, who doesn't want to listen to Tim or me speak again.